Good job, Bannock County. Wow, I'm going to be proud to report that amongst some of the other chairmen. I know that we've bested them, so thank you very much. I'm going to introduce our speaker tonight, but before I do that, I just want to remind you that the raffle is going to be closing just after my comments here. And so if you haven't placed your tickets, please do so. And but we're just so very pleased tonight to have Theo Wold with us. And he has just spent a busy week in Washington, D.C., and I'm so thankful that all the flights are running well, and he is with us here tonight. Theo Wold is a senior executive at a national security technology company. He also serves as the director of the Claremont Institute's administrative state. Mr. Wold is the former Solicitor General of Idaho. Previously, Mr. Wold served as acting assistant attorney general in the Office of the Legal Policy at the Department of Justice and as a deputy assistant to the president for domestic policy under President Donald Trump. Prior to his 3.5 years of service in the Trump White House, Mr. Wold served as Deputy Chief Counsel to United States Senator Mike Lee on the Senate Judiciary Committee. Mr. Wold holds a BA from Georgetown University, where he studied government and English. He holds a Master of Literature from the University of St. Andrews, where he studied English literature. And then he has a JD, a Doctor of Jurisprudence from the University of Notre Dame. Mr. Wold clerked at the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit for Judge Janice Rogers Brown and the United States District Court for the District of Puerto Rico for Judge Jose Antonio Fuste. Mr. Wold is an intelligence officer in a Special Operations Squadron in the United States Air Force Reserves. Mr. Wold and his wife have 5 children, and they live in Boise, Idaho. Wow. We are so happy to have Mr. Wold. Please welcome Mr. Theodore Wold.
It's always strange to hear your life story reduced to a couple sentences like that. I'm sure you all have the same takeaway. Dang, that guy spent way too much time in school. That's exactly what my dad used to say. And I'll say just up front here, some of you have heard me tell this story before. My granddaddy loved to tell this story about a bureaucrat from the U.S. Department of Agriculture who was invited out to Central Texas to speak at the annual cattlemen's dinner. And the bureaucrat went on and on and on for hours. And his speech was about increasing the import of Argentine beef. And then he started talking about the superior marbling of Japanese Wagyu. And then he said, the Brazilians, they got way better water policy than we do here in the United States. And as he was talking, he could notice that the faces on the crowd were getting angrier and angrier. And it being Texas, some of the folks were unholstering their sidearms. So he goes back to his seat at the head table next to the president of the Cattlemen's Association, and he says, I'm just looking around here, and I don't really think your audience cared for my speech much. Should I be nervous? And the president of the Cattlemen's Association says, no, we're civilized people here in Central Texas. You ain't got nothing to worry about. You're our guest. But the chairman of tonight's dinner, he's in hell of trouble. So anything I say, it's on Brian Parsons and it's on Craig, all right? Those are the people you need to blame. I'm your guest. Just keep that in mind. It's actually a real honor to be with you this evening. This is the first Lincoln Day I've done in eastern Idaho. Usually I get invited up in North Idaho. They like some of the things I like to say up there. So, and I've done a couple of things in Twin Falls, and I kind of thought that's the end of the line for me. Probably not much out beyond that. So this is great to be here with all of you in Pocatello. Yeah. No, it's worth applause because Pocatello is kind of old Idaho meets new Idaho, right? Because the story of Pocatello was always, well, it's a union labor town. It's where the railroads were. And so it's Democrat, and it's always gonna be Democrat. Right. Well, we've taken over, but here's why. Because it's a different Republican Party. This is a Republican Party of working people. People who work for a living now run this party. And so people who have spent generations in this town doing things with their hands, they're now Republicans. So Pocatello, a town of labor, is now a Republican town. And it may not show that in your city offices or your county commissioners and all that and the like, but just give it time. Give it time. So I think everyone here who's been doing the hard work of making Bannock County actually red, truly red, should be applauded. It's a tremendous work that you've all done, and it's just the beginning. So I was with the president a couple times this week. I was with the vice president a couple of times. Wild times in the White House. Wild times. And I'll just say, it's one of those moments where, in part, you have a little bit of what we call FOMO. Everyone tracking what that means? Fear of missing out. Fear of missing out. Because as was mentioned really quickly there from Craig, I was in 45 for 3.5 years. And all I got was blacklisted from employment and a t-shirt. But there was an opportunity to go back in and, well, I have a wife, right? And my wife said, "What, are you crazy?" Most days in the White House, I would get up and leave our house there in D.C. around 5 in the morning to get to the office at 5:30, and I would leave around 11:30 at night. And I'll show, I don't know if we can see it that clearly, but a friend of mine sent me something the other day. My team in the White House, I always reminded them of one thing. Here on my phone, if I can find this. I had one principle, and my friend just sent me a picture of it. I'll find it in a moment here. And the principle was, we called it the Theo principle. The principle was that we're here for a very short time. For a very short time. And it's a real privilege to work in the White House. And sometimes I'd have interns or people would join my team and they'd say, what do you mean it's a privilege? And I said, just down the hall is where Abraham Lincoln, because this is Lincoln Day, right, folks? Right? Just down the hall is where Abraham Lincoln drafted the Emancipation Proclamation. That happened here in this building. So it's a privilege to work here. It's a privilege to work on behalf of the American people, and we have one job: to do everything we can to advance the agenda of the duly elected President of the United States on behalf of the American people, period. His name was on the ballot. He sits at the resolute desk. He makes the decisions. What we do is we execute on those decisions for him. We don't supplant our judgment for his. We don't undermine the determinations he's made. And what we do is try to fulfill his policies. Gets you in a lot of trouble having that attitude. A lot of trouble. I heard later from a big bank that I interviewed with after the White House. The woman, I'll just say this, the woman who had my job under President Obama, she, when she left the White House, she went to go work for AT&T in Southeast Asia, making 8 figures. 8 figures. And month after I left the White House, I was walking in my neighborhood there in Maryland where we lived at the time, and I was walking the dogs, and I did this every day because I didn't really know what to do with myself. And this lady saw me walking the dogs, and one day she finally came up and she said, I see you walking the dog every day. You spend a long time walking the dogs. I said, that's good. It's good to know we got a neighborhood watch. I said, yes, that's right, ma'am. Yeah, I love my dogs. And she said, well, that's great. I'm glad you love your dogs. Do you have a job? I said, and you're thinking through your head, just, a month ago, I was advising the President of the United States, and here I am picking up dog poop. No, I don't have a job. I'm still working on that. So the world was different for us Trump folks coming out of the first administration. Some of you may know this, some of you may not, but there was a blacklist. As a senior technology official told me recently, look, Kellyanne Conway was always going to get her book deal. And so was Bill Barr. And a lot of the young people that worked for me and others decided to go to law school, to grad school, do those internships at Google. The real effort from the left was to make an example out of that middle tier of folks inside the White House, so that people would know if you break the convention, if you work for Donald Trump, you'll never work again. So a lot of us had a hard time coming after the White House, if you can believe that. And this is a long way of saying what I'm really thankful for is all of you. Because Idaho gave my wife and I and our family not just a safe haven, but a real community. It was a real place to call home. And I'm blessed to call the vice president a friend. And many of you have seen the vice president and the second lady traveling around the world now with their children. And so I'm testing the proposition tonight, bringing my kids here to this evening. And the proof is in. The jury's come back, which is not a single one of you folks, at least not here, maybe on the car ride home, said, well, that's crazy. That guy brought his kids with him. And why? Because this is Idaho. Idaho doesn't just love kids. Idaho loves a lot of kids, big families. I was in Hungary 2 weeks ago speaking at a conference that the Prime Minister of Hungary put on about family policy. And this will come as kind of a surprise to all of you because it's not an issue here in Idaho. But everywhere else in the Western world, the biggest economic threat looming in the horizon is birth dearth, the disappearance of whole nations, the collapse of the population. And the answer for a long time from folks, especially in Western Europe, was it doesn't matter if we Swedes aren't having babies anymore, 1.12 births per household in Sweden. It doesn't matter if us Norwegians aren't having babies anymore, 1.19 births per household. We'll just import workers through immigration. We'll bring in our workforce, and we'll maintain the welfare state that way. One of the untold stories about mass immigration into the United States, when it really started from Mexico, with President Reagan's amnesty in 1986, Mexico had a birth rate about 7.1 births per household. What's Mexico's birth rate now? 1.3 per household, lower than the United States. So where's the labor going to come from? And so Hungary has been leading the way, sort of, in Europe to think about how do you structurally change the way people think about families and having children. You get off the plane in Budapest and there's a big sign, I kid you not, and it says, in Hungary, we love families. We're glad you brought your kids. In Hungary, they give tax incentives And when I say tax incentives, what I mean is you don't pay taxes anymore if you're a household with 3 or more children. Mothers get 6 months of maternity leave. Whether you're a secretary at a school or you're a lawyer at one of the largest companies in Hungary, you get 6 months of maternity leave. And people will say, well, that's socialism. What the Hungarians say is it's preserving the nation. It's putting mothers who literally birth the nation at the center of our social, economic, and political life. I say all of this because Idaho, what's our birth rate? 6.8 per household. And that's what I shared with Hungary. I said, well, you want the solution, you should come to Idaho. And the prime minister of Hungary, I met with him later, and he said, so I heard your speech. It was very interesting. I've always wanted to come to Iowa. I said, no. No, Idaho, Rocky Mountain State. He said, oh, yes, okay. And you have professional sports franchises in Columbus. I said, no, that's Ohio. Not Iowa, not Ohio. Put them together. It's Idaho. And yes, in Idaho, we have big families. We love children. We love what they contribute to our social, political, economic life, and we're not ashamed to share that with the rest of the world. And that's something, again, I was very proud, even though I was on my, something of some hard luck. I was proud to be adopted and accepted into the community here in Idaho, and I'm very proud that my children are growing up Idahoan. So real quick, there's some friends of mine here. There are familiar faces, but just to give you, just a quick gloss on who I am, because some of you are probably like, why is this guy here? So after the White House, I came out here and I ran a campaign for a guy you may have heard of, Raul Labrador. And we took on a 23-year incumbent attorney general, and we got Raul elected AG. And I got to go around the state and spend time in places like here in Pocatello and Idaho Falls and Declo and Lava Springs and all kinds of places I didn't even know existed. And I learned a lot. Because there's all kinds of fancy ideas you can read about in textbooks about political science. And there's all kinds of cool white papers you can read from think tanks in DC. And there's all kinds of really cool ideas you can structure and create for the President of the United States. Where policy really matters is here in the smallest unit possible, the local community. That's where the rubber hits the road, right? What it means for your dental office, what it means for the small business of 5 employees. That's where you learn what's really happening in our country. So I served as Solicitor General, and I argued a number of times in the Ninth Circuit in defense of our right to have the death penalty here in Idaho, to defend our state's abortion laws. And then I also argued once in the Idaho Supreme Court against this boneheaded idea you may have heard of called the ranked choice voting. So we as a family made the decision not to move back to Washington, D.C. this time, to stay here in Idaho. It was a hard call. It was a really hard call. That's that you all tracking now, FOMO, the fear of missing out. It was a hard call, but my wife put it pretty bluntly with me. She said, me and the children, we love Idaho. We can't explain you. You want to go back to D.C., you can do it, but you can visit on the weekends. We're going to be here. And so I said, all right, I got my marching orders. We're going to be here in Idaho. But as was mentioned by Craig, I've been helping out since on transition and working with the Vice President's office and those guys. And since this is a mixed audience, I'll edit what I usually say. Those guys with really big ideas. The Doge team. And I'll just say right now, because there are people who have mixed feelings about the Doge team, right? Especially there are a lot of folks, including here in Idaho, who have described themselves some of them, for decades as fiscal hawks. You know, this thing people say, well, you know, I don't really get into social policy. That's, you know, whatever happens in your bedroom, that's you. And they'll say, oh, you know, I don't really care about foreign policy, whatever's going on. I can't even find that place on a map. But I really want the government to be cost effective, to live within its means. I want it to be small. I'm a fiscal hawk. And so what's been happening with Doge, it reminds me of this old story that Lincoln told about, he was at a saloon in some western town, and this guy walks in. He's a shady-looking character, and he looks around, and there's a gentleman at the bar, and he's got his coat hung up on one of the pegs, one of the columns there on the bar. And the guy who walks into the saloon looks around real quick, and he snatches the coat, and he starts running. And the guy who was at the saloon yells out for help. He says, Marshal, the guy took my coat. The marshal says, whoa, sees him running down the street, so they both make chase. And the marshal says, you better stop and put down that coat. And the guy keeps running, and so he gets out his six-shooter, and he aims, and then the guy says, hey, whoa. Aim for the pants, not the coat. Aim for the pants. And Lincoln told that story as a way of saying, people care about a principle only so far as it doesn't touch their own self-interest. You're a fiscal hawk until the cuts come to the government agency in your town, to the wasteful, malfeasant fraud that you prosper from. And then it's, don't put a hole in my coat, aim for the pants. And so Doge has been doing a lot of interesting work, a lot of really interesting work. And I'm sure you all have found some of those stories about, you know, the different agencies. One of my favorites is the Federal Mediation Council. You ever heard of this little group? Federal Mediation Council. Anyone here work for the Federal Mediation Council? It's a possibility. It's a possibility because there's 18 people who work there. 17 of them work remote. They ain't in D.C., so one of you could be a Federal Mediation Council employee. There was one gentleman who worked for the Federal Mediation Council for 20 years, and he worked remote in Des Moines, but he put that as a travel assignment. So you all generously paid to reimburse him for his house payments, for his daily trip in his car, and you gave him a per diem. And who says Americans aren't generous? That was mighty kind of you all to do that for that guy for 20 years. You know, there was another individual at the Federal Mediation Council who contracted with a small multimedia vendor to the tune of about $100,000 a year. Now, this is just between friends, right? The multimedia vendor turned out to be his wife. I mean, come on. So, he's keeping it in the business, keeping it in the family. $100,000 a year to record promotional videos for the Federal Mediation Council, right? That's what you're all thinking. It's for the Federal Mediation Council, right? No, for weddings, for friends, for a bluegrass band that they liked. You all paid for that too. And that was really generous of you. The Federal Mediation Council, this is the question that you should be asking. What is that? What is that? Well, the Federal Mediation Council was created by President Roosevelt in his second term, and it exists to negotiate contracts between federal unionized workers and federal employees. Federal unionized workers, i.e. federal employees, negotiating with other federal employees. And that's the world that we live in. You show up late, you're fired. You don't account for the rounds that you did as an occupational therapist or a nurse at your clinic or hospital. That's a constructive discipline that will get you fired. You don't show up to work for 16 and a half years as was the case with a NASA engineer that I saw when I was a clerk at the DC Circuit, 16 and a half years, he didn't come to work, you get promoted. You get lifetime health benefits. And you have an entire organization, a component of the federal government that exists to negotiate your labor disputes. So for those of you who are unsettled about the pace of change, a little confused about what is DOGE really doing, I'll give it to you in a very simple formulation. One-line thesis. It is returning accountability in a democratically elected government to the people, period. And so the president says, this is a golden age, right? Have you heard this? He said, this is a golden age. Now, some of you, I can already tell, you're like, well, that made a lot more sense 2 weeks ago. My 401k looks a lot different. My stock portfolio is a lot different, Theo. Not much golden going on here. But that aside for a moment, just for a moment. The golden age, what is it about? What would make it golden? Let's drill down into that. Let's define it, right? Because some of you, I hope, will go out after this evening and you'll engage with your crazy Kamala Harris voting daughter, or your uncle who says Pete Buttigieg is going to be the next president of the United States. And hopefully you'll say, hey, you know what? Here's what the golden age is really about. 3 things. American independence. And when I say that now, sure, it harkens back to our founding fathers, President Washington, truly being an independent sovereign nation. But it means something a little bit different in a modern context. If you can't make aspirin here in the United States, you are not independent. If you can't make the component parts of a basic Ford F-150, you are not an independent nation. Or here's one that should keep you all up at night. If you can't make basic armament for the uniformed branches of the US military, you are not an independent nation. So American independence today means making things here with our own hands, the things that we need, and building an American industry that serves our nation. The second part of the golden age is individual independence. The ability for there to be meaningful meritocracy in our social and political life. That you rise not by immutable characteristics that you have no control over. The color of your skin, your sex, which I guess maybe you could have that assigned. These immutable characteristics have nothing to do with the kind of character you have or your capacity for human excellence. And so the barriers that have been erected by the radical left are being stripped away to ensure the best and the brightest get the opportunities they deserve. Independence among American individuals has been the hallmark of our nation's history. It's what made us great. We're standing here in Pocatello, Idaho, a place that was carved out of the wilderness by individual pioneers. And they had the most meritocratic system of all. If you don't flourish, you die, right? If you can't hunt, farm, or figure out a way to trade for it, you ain't gonna eat. And it's a really long, hard, cold winter in East Idaho. That's what America was built on. And the third, as I mentioned, is the control and the accountability of your own government. Not the deep state, which is a real thing. It's not just a scary story I tell to my children. It's a real thing. It's not the deep state. You didn't vote for them. You didn't elect the administrator of NOAA. He never put his name on a ballot, so why is he determining what kinds of cars you can drive and what kinds of carbon emissions are acceptable in different types of industry? Accountability in our government means you, the people, govern, right? Or did we forget that? Did we forget that? I was at a talk at the Reagan Library 2 weeks ago, and I scandalized the entire place. I did. They were ready to run me out of there on a rail. And I said at one point, my wife is also a lawyer. She's a way better lawyer than I am. And I said, hey, it could be that y'all invited the wrong Wold. Maybe you meant to bring my wife here. But what I told them was, I told them, and I'll give you a quick version of this story. When I joined the Air Force, I had like a midlife crisis in the White House, right? I said, well, I'm around all these people who are serving in uniform, and I'd really like to do the same. I'm inspired by your level of excellence in the way that you selflessly serve our nation. And I tried for years to join the United States Navy. My grandfather was a Pearl Harbor survivor, thought we were a Navy family, and Navy wouldn't have me for a variety of reasons, some of which I won't go in here. But I was told to apply to the Air Force, and so finally I get into the Air Force after moving out here to Idaho, and I have to report to officer training school. And the first 2 weeks of officer training school are massive indoctrination, right? You're shaping people like me straight off the street to become U.S. military officers, get into the culture of the United States military. And everywhere you go, every instructor who's screaming in your face, or in some instances, one I had, which was 5'2", screaming at me from up here, about you're here, and the difference between you and an enlisted man is you put you raise your hand, you take an oath to what? Well, I'm sorry, one more time. The Constitution. Not a man, not a political party, not an ideology, but you take an oath to the United States Constitution. And they repeat that over and over and over again. And my two roommates, one was from Guatemala, the other was from Zimbabwe. It's late in the day, right? It's late Roman Republic. We hire mercenaries to fight our wars now. And they say to me, hey, Theo, you keep talking about this Constitution thing. Like, what is that? I'm not joking. Like, what is that? And so my one roommate from Zimbabwe, I was kind of breaking it down for him. Hey, this is what the Constitution's about. He says, well, you know that because you're a lawyer, right, Theo? And I said, well, I know it because I'm an American. That's why I know it, right? And so we were waiting. 2 weeks go by, and there's not actually been the introduction of the Constitution, right? And I was thinking it was going to be like this big mystery reveal. Ta-da! And here she is, the Constitution. And it was going to be like a big thing. Because as Plato says, and don't fall asleep on me here, I did just say, as Plato says. As Plato says, this is how you keep the guardians, those with a warrior spirit, in check. That's how you ensure that they don't harm the rest of us who don't carry around weapons every day, is you translate their energy, their charisma, their vigor into a source that's bigger than them, and they learn to respect civilian authority so they don't take up arms against judges, against senators, against the president. Because have you noticed that's never happened in our country, right? I teach a course on the problem of political violence in Guatemala. And one time a Chilean military colonel, he said to me, I get all this rule of law stuff you're talking about, Wold. I get it. Yeah, sure, okay. But the judges, they don't have guns, my friend. Right? That happens in other countries. But here in America, it's never happened. And why? Because of the Constitution. So we get to Constitution Day in officer training school. And it turns out it's not a day. It's a half hour. It's a half hour. And the JAG who was presenting this material comes in. And she says, before we start, I want us all to have a common baseline here. And the common baseline is this. The Constitution is a systemically racist document written by white male slave owners. And it's designed to oppress most of you. I like to think she was looking right at me when she said that. Most of you. And we have evidence of that it's still true. even today, because the MAGA rats, her phrase, not mine, used the Constitution. They used this little known thing called the Electoral College in 2020 to try and oppress and reduce the votes of minorities in big cities like New York and Los Angeles. So to finish this story and get to my point, I spoke up. As Worley knows, more than many, you get yourself in trouble when you speak up in the United States military. I spoke up, stand at attention, you gotta, get into proper formation to ask a question. She says, oh, you have a question about the material. O.T. Wold. I said, no, actually, I have a comment, ma'am. Oh, you have a comment? Yes, ma'am. Just a quick clarification. What you've said actually contradicts what Madison, I know it all, right? What Madison says at the Constitutional Convention, the Electoral College was actually designed to protect minority votes. That's the great ingenuity of our founding fathers. They didn't want Tammany Hall to be the basis of how you win and vote in elections for the whole country. They wanted the person who lives in New York to have as much say in an election as the person who lives in Cheyenne, Wyoming. So they designed the electoral. Isn't it just truly inspiring that they designed this? Thinking forward to a nation that would encompass 300 million souls covering an entire continent. I got 6.5 hours of KP duty for that comment. And so what I said to the good people at the Reagan Library is I said, constitutionalism is dead. It's dead. The Constitution is very much alive. It's there. But constitutionalism can only live if you commit the Constitution and you revere it. Commit it to memory. You know it, you live it, and you share those principles with your fellow citizens and your family. Otherwise, it's just a parchment piece of paper stored in the National Archives. So constitutionalism is dead unless you live it. So the folks at the Reagan Library had the same reaction you all have here, which is dead silence, a lot of dirty looks, and I quickly pivoted and said, look, think back to where we were just a few years ago, 2008. Ancient history, right? 2008. Anyone remember that? A different golden age of hope and change. And Lois Lerner investigating local community advocacy groups using the IRS against American citizens. The creation of a whole new entitlement program that the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court said was not a tax. Right? The beginning of so many of the things we have now had to confront in our local schools and local communities. The elimination of meritocracy, the enshrinement of race essentialism, that the color of your skin determines what access to education, to healthcare is permissible in our society. And it looked like, I'm going to be honest, folks, it looked like we were just never going to win again. The Republican Party was essentially dead in the water. Dead. And now look where we are. Look where we are. My good buddy, Kash Patel at the FBI. Marco Rubio at Secretary of State. Yeah, doing a great job. Bobby Kennedy Jr. is the Secretary of Health and Human Services. Pete Hegseth is at DOD. And Sheriff Tom, as I like to call him, Tom Homan, is the border czar. And for some of the projects I worked on in 45, I worked on in transition here in 47, they're not just things I can talk to with my wife because they never saw the light of day. Hey, man, trust me, honey, the birthright citizenship EO, it was gonna be fire. It got signed. The President of the United States signed the Birthright Citizenship EO. He canceled DEI. He is enforcing our nation's immigration laws. He banned biological men from being in women's bathrooms. And as I know many of you can appreciate who are veterans, who are currently serving, the DoD is now emphasizing lethality and war fighting. It's pretty amazing. But just 20 years ago, less than, it was a very bleak outlook. And my point is things can change, and they can change quickly. And what we're taught in the military, one thing we would often do in the White House is our strategy would often be based not on visualizing success. What does it look like if we, do the Michael Jordan sky jam over our opponents and we score 60 points a night and everything goes perfectly? Anybody can come up with that strategy, right? What you have to do as a farmer, as a small business owner, is you have to think through all the contingencies if things do not go right. And that's the same in the US military, it's the same in the White House. There's a famous Harvard Nobel Prize winning psychologist, I won't belabor his point here, but he'd often say, the real goal is to strategize and to envision what goes wrong and how can you get ahead of it. That's what successful people do. And in many ways, that is what Doge is doing. There is a horizon in the not-so-distant future where the Chinese Communist Party decides to call in all of their financing of U.S. debt. There is a horizon in the not-so-distant future where the CCP says, it's incredible the relationship the United States has built with Taiwan. And we know how important those semiconductors are to basically everything you do, from your minivan to your refrigerator. It'd be a shame if you didn't have access to those anymore. There's a horizon in the not-so-distant future where the Chinese say, we've done this little thing called BRICS. And BRICS is no longer a handful of 7 nations. It now includes many of your former allies in Western Europe, most of Southeast Asia, and almost all of the developing world in Africa. We don't need your US dollar anymore. And so that horizon is one that is a train of bad outcomes, bad things happening to all of us. And so the strategy is to think through, okay, what do we have to do to get in front of that? And so what I want to give you tonight in closing, we'll wrap up here quickly, is what does that look like here in Idaho, right? Because you live here in Idaho, and your responsibility is to ensure that this state is governed well, right? That's how our government works. There's only so much we can do to influence DC. We can hope and we can also pray for the success of the president and this administration. But in the meantime, who's going to ensure that this state remains free and safe for all of your children and grandchildren? You. So, what are the 3 risks that I see for here in Idaho going forward? What are the 3 traps, if you will? And I'll go through them quickly. First is I'm going to insult a lot of my elders here in the room, those of you with gray or white hair, and I hope you forgive me. It's age. It's age. And don't get me wrong. Great wisdom comes with age. In a healthy, flourishing society, those who have lived long are included in the councils and the deliberations that make up the political life of the community. That's how it should be. I'm a product of my Depression-era grandparents. They're the ones who raised me. So I'm not someone who's discountenancing age. on its face. But there's a real political threat in our country right now. And it comes from a generation of politicians who, thanks to modern medicine, are living longer. And they're staying in office longer and longer and longer and longer. And you can think of some of these folks. Nancy Pelosi, she's still there. She's still there. Chuck Schumer. Chuck Schumer took his seat in the United States House of Representatives before I was born. And I ain't young no more, folks. Mitch McConnell, still there. And as I said, there can be various reasons for this, right? The way Congress is constructed now, you accumulate tenure, and the lobbyists, the swamp, if you will. The amalgamated interests that try to run our government say, the guy's been around, we know his vulnerabilities. The deep state knows their proclivities, to put it politely, i.e., how to blackmail some of these folks. And so there's very little interest from outside groups to make a change. Why break it if it keeps working and they vote the way we tell them to? Or worse, some of these folks are just captured. They just capitulated a long time ago. And they're barely, in some instances, physically able to keep doing the job, but they can kind of be medicated and pushed along. So here's how bad it's gotten. I'll give you an example of this. Anyone here know, arguably, who the third most powerful Republican in Congress is? The chair of the House Appropriations Committee. Right? Because if you know your Constitution, you know that bills of revenue, the money sluicing through the machine, that starts in the House. You follow in the news right now, we're talking about CRs and budgets and all this stuff, and most of it's just DC jargon. But the money starts in the House. And the person who sits at the top of the Appropriations Committee decides who gets paid. Literally, who gets paid. Well, in the last Congress, the chair of the Appropriations Committee was Kay Granger. You ever heard that name before? Kay Granger, 81 years old. She'd been in Congress for well over a quarter century. And she had been the top Republican on the Appropriations Committee until April of last year. And here's the funny thing, folks. She stopped coming to work in May of last year. Disappeared off the face of the earth. Kay Granger, as you would say up in North Idaho, went Bigfoot. And it gets a little bit more wild than that. There was a young, enterprising reporter from an online news rag in Fort Worth, Texas, who started wondering, why is Kay Granger missing all these votes? How could the third most powerful member of the United States House of Representatives just go missing? Where is she? And you know what he found? Her family had committed her to a care facility for dementia. The third most powerful member of Congress. And some of you will go home and say, that crazy guy was talking about the deep state. You know how I know there's a deep state, and it's not just a chupacabra or a figment of my imagination, because I really dislike State Department employees. They'll make your life hell, trust me. You know how I know it's true? Because none of you have heard this story. There wasn't a single article written in the New York Times, not a single op-ed in the Washington Post. Where's Kay Granger? All the liberal media outlets who really hate Republicans didn't spend one jot, one diddle of column space saying it's kind of weird that the third most powerful member of the House of Representatives has missed over 150 votes. None of the Republicans, including one here in Idaho, sits on the Appropriations Committee, never once said, hey, you know what, I think we should have our chairman back. We can't really do business unless the chairman actually chairs the committee. Silence. Business as usual. And here's the crazy thing. There are people, and I'm sure there's people in this room, who are angry at Doge. They're angry at DOJ for uncovering the fact that you have an 81-year-old appropriations chair who stopped coming to work. So the problem with aging politicians is they prefer the status quo. And we ain't got time for the status quo no more, folks. That horizon that I was talking about, it's coming. The status quo has to change if you want to keep the life and the liberty you've grown accustomed to. Okay, number 2, lip service. It's lip service without real work. In a moment like this, especially among Republicans, it's really easy for politicians to say the right things. MAGA, America first. I'm all for finding the malfeasance. It's a golden age, don't you know? It's really easy to get on the bandwagon. But the hard part is when we're in power, we actually have to translate ideas into real policy that benefits you and your families. And this happens both in the federal and state levels. People talk a good game. So I'll give you one example. I worked on a bill in Florida and in Texas that I thought would be a great thing to take here to my adopted state in Idaho. And it's a very simple proposition. We hear from fiscal hawks all the time that we're spending too much on per pupil education. Costs are too high. We hear from fiscal hawks all the time that we're spending too much money on corrections facilities and law and order issues. And that, man, we really got to shrink the size of government. So I said, hey, here's a really interesting idea that would inform discussion. Informed discussion, right? So you all, through the consent of the governed, can determine whether or not you like the outcome. You know what we should do is we should make plain and transparent for the taxpayers of Idaho how much money this state is spending on providing healthcare, education, and criminal justice services to illegal aliens. For example, there's an old canard that the left will trot out there and they'll say, well, illegal aliens actually commit crimes at a far lower rate than American citizens. And you know why I call it a canard? Why it's a lie? Because we don't track that statistic. That's just an assumption. And so I said, to inform public discussion, let's start tracking it. It's a simple data field. When you're being booked into a local or county or state facility, you take down their height, their weight, their eye color, their name, their social security if they have one. One more data field. Nationality and your immigration status. That's it. And I even wrote into the language, it won't be reported to ICE. Now, look, for those of you who know me, I'm an immigration hawk. I would love to report it to ICE, okay? But I said, no, we won't report it. It's just to inform the discussion. How many people are you paying to feed and provide health care? Because you provide health care to inmates, right? Some of it is better health care than you get. How much of that is going to people who shouldn't be here in the first place? How much of your overcrowding in your local school is because there's a population of students here who shouldn't be here in the first place? How much of your emergency room beds, your available medical resources, the drugs that are passed out at pharmacies are going to people who belong in another country? I believe that your healthcare system, your education system, and your criminal justice system should serve you, the people of this country. So let's just create some transparency. And many members of your legislature said, no, don't want to do that. And they had all kinds of made-up reasons, right? Well, this seems too aggressive. What would that data be good for? We don't really want to run the risk that we're making a privacy incursion among students in our schools. You can't assure us that this data won't be misappropriated or misused. Never you mind that Google basically data mines all of you and sells it to the CCP. Never you mind that your state healthcare system was hacked by the CCP and they know more about your health status than your doctor. Never you mind. And so lip service without real work will make the golden age just a slogan. Make hay while the sun is out, right? And the last thing I want to give you, And I hope this is of some help or some countenance for you in this difficult moment economically, which is it's very easy to be distracted by what we call micro-narratives. Micro-narratives. What's a micro-narrative? This is like a postmodern philosophical idea, which is there's reality. It's what you can see with your own two eyes. It's what you know that's happening in your schools, in your community, on the highway. It's what you see when you're buying eggs, paying for milk. And then the media says, but that's not really the real story, okay? The real story is that we need China to make our aspirin. The real story is that it would be better for Idaho if Chinese nationals took up all of the graduate programs in computer science, engineering, and mathematics. It's better for you, right? So in this time, right now, micro-narratives are everywhere. And they're there to confuse you. They're there to change your direction. And they're there for you, essentially, to lose the plot. And all I can say to that is, I hope you're convicted about what the plot really is all about. I hope you're convicted. And if you're not, some of that conviction should come from the source documents themselves. Go back and read the Constitution, and then you should be convicted. So look, there's a lot of pain that's going to happen here in the short term. And since I met a dentist in the room this evening, I'll say it's a lot like those of you who eat sweets and drink your Mountain Dew. I know there's some Mountain Dew fanatics in this room here tonight. And then you never brush your teeth. You never brush your teeth. But man, do you get in the dentist's face when he puts that first jab of Novocaine in your mouth. Right? It's the dentist's fault. It's the dentist's fault that you got a mouth full of rotten teeth. He's the one to blame. When all the dentist is trying to do is fix the bigger problem, which is that your teeth are rotten. You've had a rotten government for a long time, folks. A long time. 40 years, at least, of lies, obfuscation, concealment, and all kinds of decisions being made on your behalf without ever once asking you for your consent. So if we're going to have a golden age, it starts here with all of you taking responsibility for your government. There was a golden age in the past, right? Are we all tracking that? There've been actually a couple of golden ages. Some have been quite short. Mussolini said he was going to have a golden age. That did not work out well. King David said he was going to have a golden age as well. You're all familiar with that? A golden age of prosperity for the tribes of Israel. I figured this is appropriate since our meeting space here. And under King David, ultimately, let's set aside any of his own moral incontinence. He rose to eventually be a virtuous king. And the tribes of Israel prospered. They were united, and they were peaceful, and they were able to gain vindication over their enemies. And what created this golden age under King David? It was really, above all else, fidelity to God and his covenant. They did what God asked them to do. And you know what happened under King Solomon when he abandoned God's injunctions. It is no different in our own time. Our nation, as you know, is founded on Judeo-Christian virtues. And the prosperity we have all enjoyed, really, we're dwarfs on the shoulders of giants. The prosperity that we have enjoyed comes from the men and women who established this foundation in God. The rule of law, the dignity of the human person, the value of honest work, and the necessity of responsibly stewarding our resources, both financial and natural. So we can create this golden age that President Trump is talking about, is talking in speech and trying to make a reality when we return to these virtues, biblical virtues, constitutional virtues, virtues of liberty, freedom, and faithfulness to God. Or we can go the way of all those other nations that have promised a golden age and ended in indignity and failure. It's your choice. That's my hope for our country. That's my hope for Idaho. And I think together, we can create and we will enjoy a golden age. Thank you.
I'm going to just present you with a blanket here. We're so thankful for Theo and that great speech, and we're so thankful that he has broken the barrier to eastern Idaho, and we want to send him home with a blanket.
Oh, that's cool.
It's Pocatello, Idaho. And
That's
thank
really
you.
cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
That's really cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
That's really cool. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Theo, and we're just on behalf of our community, our nation, we look forward to your continued work on behalf of our nation, and we are proud to call you an Idahoan. Tonight, as we close, just want to thank all the sponsors.